Hi, I'm Justin Mormon.
And I'm Katie Thornton, and this is the Re-Education of Schools podcast,
where we have open, honest conversations about how to better understand social-emotional learning, trauma-informed care, the whys behind student behavior, and how to help kids navigate it all as they go through school and life. Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the podcast. It's I Saw the Signs, ACEs, Trauma, and the Impact of all of that on everything. Right?
Wow,
that's not the whole title.
Yeah.
That's a longer title than what it should have been.
Yeah, but that's a pretty heavy. It's pretty heavy.
On everything.
Yeah.
In the next 30 minutes, we're going to cover how trauma impacts everything in life.
Yeah.
And then you'll know all of it.
Yeah, here we go.
That's a lie. That's not how it's going to work.
Yeah.
But we did want to talk about like ACEs, trauma. It's kind of we're kind of starting at the beginning and some of these thoughts so that we hopefully have a good basis for what we talk about going forward in the future. And I think it's just a good place for us to start in general.
Yeah.
Right?
I think as we're thinking about building a foundation for people, we're hoping the episodes kind of pick up. So the foundation, you start connecting the dots.
What are you saying about our first 2 episodes? They're not picked up?
Yeah. So we're hoping to build the capacity just of listeners that if you started from the beginning, you kind of would see where we went down the journey. So ACEs.
Yeah. So for people that may not know, as they're starting out, like what are ACEs? Like, a lot of people have probably heard about them. There are probably people out there that have not heard about them. Like, what are they?
Adverse childhood experiences. So it's the acronym ACEs. There's categories that go with ACEs. So physical and emotional or sexual abuse that has happened to you as a child, physical or emotional neglect as a child, and household dysfunction. So substance abuse, mental illness, imprisonment of a parent, witnessing abuse, and not feeling a sense of like belonging or safety within your own home environment growing up. You can get an ACE point for each one of those. So the study kind of started.
Yeah, I was going to say so these are these categories, but what?
Yeah, so it came out of a research study. Doctors started linking some things they started seeing, and they were like, let's investigate people a little bit further. Like I'm seeing a lot of the same chronic symptoms in communities. And so the ACE study started with the Kaiser Foundation, 1995 through 97. They got a population of suburban community together, and you can go on and take your own ACE quiz. It's going to be like a really quick, 9-question quiz, but it's actually a very complex,
Sure. So the study itself.
The study itself. Somebody said, well, you just asked those 9 questions. No, the actual study itself and the actual ACE questions are much more in-depth and complex, but they found statistically 61% of Americans live with at least one ACE, and the study's been duplicated over 25 states, and there's lots of health implications from that. Yeah,
like even if just quick research, right? Like on CDC's website has stuff about it. You can literally, if you search ACEs and studies, you can watch videos, you can see, TED Talks, you can see all kinds of stuff that talk about ACEs and give you more information. So our goal isn't necessarily to give you all the information of ACEs, but we did want you to have enough understanding. I think when I was looking on the CDC's website, it was 17%, they said, of adults report having 4 or more. Do you remember, and maybe we should have researched this ahead of time, but what is that number where they say
4?
Yeah, it's 4.
4 or more ACEs, you are at risk for health, chronic health conditions.
Yeah.
We're talking about heart disease, diabetes, stroke, substance abuse, mental illness, suicide. So chronic conditions.
This is really chipper. This is a really chipper episode.
Yeah.
This is a fun episode for us to do.
So trauma, that idea of the body keeps score, right? Trauma lives within your body. Your environment develops who you are, develops your brain, which I know is a whole nother episode, but 4 or more, you are at high risk for actual chronic health conditions. And if we can correct healing some of these ACEs, it's actually have a bigger impact within our community. I think they estimate if we can reduce the ACEs within childhood community, for children growing up, it would cut $56 billion. Jeez. Off our budget. What an impact within our communities if we would start thinking about this. And schools are the vessel in which we house and heal children right now, because we all have hands and impact within kids coming
really
in.
Front lines, right? It's like the front lines. We're the ones that educators and people in schools are the ones that are with kids so frequently. It's interesting that you focus way more on the money. I focus way more on people's health. So as people learn about us, I guess we know. I saw that on the CDC's website, their predictions, it was 1.9 million heart disease cases they feel like that could have been avoided, and 21 million cases of depression.
Yeah.
I mean, those are like some big numbers. I mean, that's big numbers of people. It's not as impactful as cash, like you brought up, but I think it is. It is still like it's crazy. Like the amount of money, the amount of resources, the amount of time that we spend, kind of responding to a problem, right? Like reacting to a problem that exists. And I think that's really what this all has been about, right? Like the idea was, let's figure it out. And they're like, oh my gosh, there are a lot of people that have these adverse childhood experiences. What can we do to not just react, but what can we do to prevent in the first place? Because reacting versus preventing, obviously we always want to fall on the side of prevention, right? I mean, that's way better.
Yeah, I think the prior to school age, right? That's an education system. That's a problem we can't solve, but like a greater conversation for our community. But we have kids coming in and we're already kind of being reactive in kindergarten when kids are walking in with some ACEs and they're not feeling that sense of safety or belonging, because what we know is ACEs create kids to live in their downstairs brain. Yeah. So what we talked about in our last episode, the prefrontal cortex, and like kids trying to work their way up to the spot where they can learn. So we have to start down from the basics. We see kids' behavior.
Yeah, like a bottom up. We will hear that as a bottom up approach, right?
Yeah. And even though you may say, well, I don't have kids, like a lot of kids walking around in my classroom with like a 4 as ACE score, but one ACE in someone's life, including your own, has a great impact on how you perceive, develop, and kind of relate with the world. Yeah. So it's not, you don't have to have like an ACE score of 4 and have the 1 will get you impact on what's happening with your everyday life.
Yeah, I think there was a time when we just assumed that like, oh, stuff happens to people and then they move on. Right. Like, and then it's fine now. Like now they're okay. Like, or
that happened when they were 3.
Like it was resolved, I mean, now it's okay now, or they don't remember. Really little kids don't remember. But I think that's what's important. And you touched on already, is that our bodies do remember, and actually it can have like really crazy impacts. And, it's just super interesting. Like if you don't know much about any of that, we don't have time to get into all of it today for sure. But I think that's something that's really important to research and learn more about, or that could be helpful, because I think that you could start to understand, especially as a teacher or an educator, what that means and how that impacts kids.
The first 1,000 days of life are more important than anything that's ever for kids. And we have to kind of go back to, that's probably a whole nother podcast episode, but going back to thinking about those first 1,000 days and how impactful it is for kids. You said something about the impact in like how, that happened to somebody and that it was 3 and then, right? What happens with trauma? Like you and I could have the same experience, right? So we're living in that experience, and you'll say, well, that happened to me. My parents were divorced and I'm fine. Sure. Or why is that different outcomes for people?
Well, I mean, again, I'm no scientist, but I think that from what I've heard, from what I've researched, the reality is we're all just different people, right? So as much as sometimes that can be like an infuriating concept for whatever reason to people, that everyone's different. And so we could have the exact same upbringing. My parents talk about this a lot, referencing my parents in the podcast a lot, but hey, shout out to my parents. But I think that, you can raise kids in a family basically the same way, but we're different people. That's the reality. We're different people. So stuff's going to impact us all differently. And so, and I think time of life also plays into that. Something that might happen to somebody when they're 1 or 2 versus something that happens to somebody when they're 14, even if it's the same kind of event, they can be like, the 14-year-old person might have a way more steady 14 years worth of
resiliency.
Yeah, resiliency that's been built up. Whereas, maybe a 2 or 3-year-old has not had a very, steady life that has taught them that things are going to be okay and that they can bounce back and that the world's on their side and things like that. So I think there's just a whole slew of factors, right? Where the community you live in, like, is there safety and a feeling of that there? So there's all these factors, right? Yeah. Like that make it to where we can have the same experience. But since we're different people, it's not gonna land the same way, and our bodies and our minds are gonna react to it long term even differently. Yeah, that's just how that is. Again, that's weirdly infuriating to people sometimes, and and even me. Like there are times that I'm like, well, I've had the same kind of experience, or like I've done just as well, or whatever it might be, and yet I have to remind myself, but I'm not that same person. Yeah, right. I haven't had every other experience that person's had. So I can't just say that because they experienced one thing, it's going to be the same for them.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? I mean, what's your think on that? What you're thinking on that? Is that the same as, I mean, is there extra?
Yeah, I think, you talk about event, experience, and effect are like the 3 E's of trauma. And I think you have 2 kids that walk into a classroom and experience the exact same thing in their life, but the same event, but the experience may have been different for them and the effects are different because of those resiliency and those early factors put into place and how they recover from it.
Yeah.
We see that even with teachers in the classrooms, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, everybody can have, it's just, there are too many factors for it to be as simple as I also experienced X thing. And so they should be fine because I am fine.
Yeah.
Right. It's just too complex for that. Okay. So we were throwing around trauma a lot, right?
Yeah.
Like in this whole conversation. Yeah. So what is, like, we've got to know what trauma is.
Yeah. I think it's the way your
Apparently
body...
I'm expecting you to answer that.
Okay, I got this one. So it's the way your body holds on to an experience, right? Your nervous system, that lasting emotional, and it's going to be different for each person. But your body has memory. We can go into this probably much deeper brain base, those core memories that go in. And it could be even just a little evocative cue within a classroom environment that can trigger a kid's trauma, like the lights being turned off in the classroom, the smell of the teacher, the sound effect, or
tone of voice.
Tone of voice, right? So then your body sometimes unconsciously doesn't even realize why you're shutting down, or you kind of start feeling that anxious, nervous feeling and thinking through how your body's holding on to that experience. And some of us are resilient and are able to pass through that. And the way to get through it is to have, those resiliency moments.
Okay, so if I'm a teacher, which I am, I'm going to be like, I listen to this part, right? I listen to this part. And what I immediately start to think is, so what you're telling me is I've got to constantly walk on eggshells 100% of the time. Yeah. I need to know so much about every one of my kids that I know exactly what's going to be a problem for them all the time. Yeah. I have to make sure that nothing upsets a kid at any point in time, right? That's what I think that's sometimes what people start hearing. Yeah. Right. And I think what's important to pause for just a second and say that's not the expectation. Yeah. The expectation is not that we suddenly never inadvertently cause a person, whether it's a student or a classroom or just a person out in life, to have a negative reaction again. That's not the purpose, and it's not realistic. I mean, let's just be real. That's just not realistic. But I think sometimes we hear this part of a conversation and we can shut down really quick as educators because we're like, well, that's going to be impossible. Yeah. It's impossible for me to not do one of these things. How am I supposed to control the tone of my voice? Yeah. How am I supposed to control that I've grown a beard and this student had a really negative interaction that was severe with an adult male who had a beard. Yeah. And I didn't have a beard when I started the year, and now the kid's having a problem with me because I do have a beard. And like, how am I supposed to, there's no way I can control everything, right? I mean, does that make sense? And
I think as we look at kids, we don't need to know the history, right? Yeah. I think it's important that we don't need to dive deep and sit down with kids. So what happened to you when you were 2, right?
Sure. We don't need to read like a 100-page document.
This is just to give you some foundational understanding of why, as we start peeling back layers of kids that are in tier 3, right? Some of our students that are maybe beyond those type, we look at behavior. We've tried the traditional tier 1, tier 2 best practices, and we're getting to kids with deeper behavioral things going on as we're peeling back the layers or then unlocking the nesting boxes, right, to get down to what's happening. This is one factor we need to think about and look at and analyze our classroom and say, oh, I did notice every time this is the thing that changed or this happened, this could be a trigger for this child. And it goes back to how we respond. Yeah. Doesn't matter what happened or what the diagnosis is or in the stuff, it's how we respond and interact with kids.
Yeah. How we adjust as we learn some of those things about kids and how we use that information, I guess, that we realize, and some of that data that we end up collecting, whether it's officially or just unofficially in our minds as we're going throughout our day, which is what we do as teachers just so frequently. Okay. So some people are going to say, just a bold assumption, I assume some people are going to say, well, I live actually in a really great community. Yeah. Like we actually live in like a really nice community. That's one of the reasons I wanted to teach there. It's one of the reasons I moved there. We actually, in our district, we actually don't have trauma. We don't have a lot of that. We're pretty okay. Yeah. Thoughts on that? What's your take on that?
I think that's the myth that's currently being debunked, right? Yeah. I think that's where we're making the shift. Talking about our previous episode, why is the shift occurring? I think we're all realizing that ACEs do not have boundaries.
Yeah.
It's happening in every community. Looking at yourself, what your ACE score is, and the impact that it will have. So I think we're finding that to be absolutely untrue. And if you look at statistically saying kids walking in your classroom, you've got lots of kids holding at least one ACE point within your classroom. Does it
Yeah.
just be mindful of it, and how can you adjust some of your practices and respond to some of those kids in their difficult moments
Yeah.
is really what we're looking at.
Yeah, I think it's a defense. Well, and that could potentially offend people, I guess. But like, I think for me, like, there's this idea that maybe it feels better to think
Yeah,
that
not here.
that there aren't awful things that happen here. I think that was one of the things. There's all kinds of stuff I hate about social media, or the prevalence of like
Yeah.
a billion news stations you can watch all the time, nonstop
Yeah.
news, just being inundated. But I think one of the things that has done as well, that's maybe positive, has highlighted how many great communities, good communities have some stuff that's going on that maybe people don't want to talk about a lot, but that it's existing. So I
Yeah.
think it's just important to realize that, like you said, is everywhere. Trauma has no boundaries. It's not allowed in certain cities. There's
Yeah.
not certain states that don't allow trauma, and it's going to be fine here. And so that's just important to remember, because I think a lot of us might fall. It would be easy to be in a really nice district,
Yeah.
and in a really good district, and to then be able to say, well, actually, like, kid A, B, and C over here are just kind of jerk kids
Yeah.
and problems.
Yeah.
There's not like a lot of background behind why, because we live in such a good community. So there couldn't be some
Yeah.
backstory. I think there is no boundary to that. It's possible everywhere.
Yeah.
And not even just possible, it exists everywhere.
Yeah, and some of this is historical trauma,
Yeah.
intergenerational trauma. Sometimes it's that vicarious trauma of feeling for other people's trauma,
Yeah.
right? Like, so there's so many complex layers to within trauma, and then the various degrees from acute to chronic complex trauma. Probably way deeper than we're going to get into today, but like, it's bigger than what I think anybody ever thought, and I think we're starting to peel back the curtain to be like, oh, as
Yeah.
we look at kids and families and understand coming from a place of understanding now.
Yeah. And the word that I think coming back to as we go through all this process is just like, it can be uncomfortable, right? It can be uncomfortable
Really.
for us to start taking a real honest look at how things are sometimes. But you have to be willing to push through some of the uncomfortableness
Yeah.
to get to the spot where you can do impactful work, and you can actually be like a change agent, I guess, for kids and families who have had a really hard time. Okay, so this is like kind of some of the background about it, but how does this actually impact the everyday like classroom? How does this impact us like when we're in our classroom teaching?
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Well, I think it starts with building a classroom community, of creating a restorative community where we kind of accept and talk about problems and issues within our classroom.
Yeah.
So no longer we can start our classroom like, let's get to work. Here you are.
Yeah.
Welcome
Everybody's
to school.
ready to go.
Everyone's ready to go, because
yeah.
we know kids are not walking in ready to go anymore.
Yeah.
A lot of them. And so we just start our classroom communities and establish those differently. We know kids are learning differently. And like we've talked about before, it starts with getting kids into the space where they can learn.
Yeah.
So it changes the role of the teacher, as sometimes you're more a co-regulator. Sometimes you're creating that time and space for kids to re-regulate or take breaks, changing the structure of how we're teaching in our classroom so that doesn't matter what the trauma was, it's how can we respond and get kids back to a place where they're able to learn.
Yeah. I think too, like, even because you can start listing stuff off, and it can start feeling again a very daunting task, right? And we do have to start somewhere. We have to start actually making like actual changes, in how we do things. But I think very baseline, I just really believe like it helps us, this understanding, knowing that this stuff exists and knowing a little bit more about it, even in a very like surface level kind of way, really. But knowing more about it hopefully starts changing our understanding of who's in our class, and gives us a little bit of a different lens to look through, right? Like, so I can start looking through a lens of not just who's not following the rule that I have set in place, which is fine to have rules set in place. I don't want to insinuate that, or like who's not okay, like staying within the boundary that's been, described and that everyone else kind of agrees on, like who's struggling with that. And to be able to see that through a lens, less of now that's a problem, that student's a problem, but instead being able to see it through a lens of, okay, so what's going on below the surface, what's going on in the past, and how can I react to that, or how can I find out more? What steps do I need to take to even find out more, whether that's relationally with the kid or whether that's background information I need to find or whatever that might be. But I think that's like to me, like that's such a basic starting point, is to, even if you're not going to implement anything differently in your classroom come tomorrow, you've listened to this and now you're like, well, I don't know what to do. Just start paying attention to how kids react and how that makes you feel. Yeah. I think that's like such a good starting point.
And I think it always goes back to, I think you always say this well, goes back to the empathy. Yeah. Approaching things with such an empathetic.
Steal my thunder.
I know. Sorry. you do it well though. So carry us through with that. So like, just coming at kids instead of so harsh. Or so authoritative. Not that it's not without boundaries. It's always, love always has boundaries, right? Yeah. But that empathy, and I see that you're having a hard time right now. And how can I best support you through that moment?
Yeah, I think sometimes we hear these conversations as educators and we think, well, then that means like anything goes, because now that kid has a free pass because they have X, Y, or Z, right? And sometimes from a very like sympathetic place, we as educators want to fall in like, well, like I really don't want to make this kid have a hard day by putting in this boundary that I know that they don't like and whatever else. And so then we let kids do too much, or we don't provide the boundaries, which again, like you pointed out, is actually very unloving to not have the boundaries and just to be like, well, you can do whatever. And that's okay. That's not a true loving kind of relationship with anybody. And I think we have to be able to be in that spot, right, where we can empathetically say, like, I don't just have sympathy for you. Like, I'm not just like, oh, like I feel so bad for you, but it's okay. Like I can understand maybe why this is happening. Mm-hmm. However, now I have to walk this kid through why it's not okay. Their reaction is not okay, and we have to figure out together kind of how to shift, which again, a whole nother podcast episode, right? Like down the road somewhere.
Yeah. I would say that kind of where I landed a little bit was more the sympathetic. Yeah. Instead of being empathetic. And I feel like through conversations that we've had, it really helped me shift that it was okay to be empathetic and still have that hard boundary, because it is some of these stories are hard to hear.
Yeah, there's awful stuff that goes on.
What they didn't have was that loving, supportive boundaries, and that's why they need the safe, trusted adult. And I think we hear all the time through. We know kids need a sense of safety and belonging, and that seems so ambiguous sometimes when we say that. But that's ultimately in your classroom. That's how it impacts you, because you have to create those boundaries and that classroom community so they do feel a sense of belonging, and that you're the consistent, resilient adult in their life, so that they come back and they do have that sense of safety. Not that you're going out and having this like elaborate special, I'm going to have lunch with you every day, I'm going to give up my planning time, or we're hanging out at the park after school. Nobody's saying that. It's just those little micro interactions you have with kids to let them know that you care and that you're there for them.
Yeah. And that you're going to keep being there for them. I think that's such a big thing with kids, right? That you're going to continue to be there with them. Mm-hmm. You're not going to be somebody that just because they had a really rough day or a really rough week even, or have had a really rough quarter, we have all of those. It's been a really rough year, like we got to the end, but that you're still there and that you still care about them, that you're not somebody that is going to just toss them aside, and you're not somebody that just let them do whatever and pretty much lost a year's worth of time of
instruction and
everything else. Yeah. Okay. So you mentioned earlier something about like knowing our own aces. Yep. And how that maybe impacts us in our classroom. I was thinking like one of the biggest things that I pass on to younger teachers that I try, like whenever I'm in a conversation, they're like, oh, what are things that, you wish you knew whenever. Like, I think that one of the biggest things is just really knowing yourself well in a lot of different ways. So I think the ACE study is like a good place to start on that. But personality tests, especially people in college, like you in all likelihood have gone through classes where you've taken all kinds of personality tests and things like that. But I think there's a lot of value in just knowing yourself. Yeah. Because if you know yourself and you know some of the obstacles that you're up against, and you know your strengths, and if you just know yourself well, you have a much better understanding and opportunity, I think, to run a room and to impact kids in a way that doesn't let you get lost in all of it, like emotionally, in your thought process yourself. Because in any given school day, a ton happens that like we take in so much as educators, right? And it can be easy then to go home and just replay every little thing and get overwhelmed by how we reacted or whatever else. I think that it's really good to know yourself in general and understand then how some of the things that might happen in your classroom might lead to the reactions you're having.
Yeah, or your past experiences.
Yes.
How your past experience has been brought into the classroom, and when kids do something, it may be a trigger for me if it's not a trigger for you.
Yeah.
And that's why we see some kids who chronically do well in certain classrooms, because some of those teachers, great teachers, right, are really noticeable about their own regulation.
Yeah.
And how to be able to compartmentalize, not bringing that in, and learning to tap out when you're done.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, and learning how to like adjust, right? Like, okay, I realize this isn't the day for me. I thought I was going to do all these great things today, and now it's, 10:15 and I realize, oh, I'm actually out. But instead of feeling some weird self-imposed kind of, obligation to like power through, to be able to adjust ourselves and say, hey, you know what, this afternoon, we're going to scrap the 3 things we were going to do. And now we're going to do these 3 things instead that are like way lower key and easy. I think it's just important if you know yourself well, you know where your limits are. And hopefully it also gives you a little bit of permission then to lean into that some and be like, today's not the day for me.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean I'm a bad person. And
Nope.
it doesn't mean that
We're all
I'm
human.
an awful,
Yeah.
educator, or that I've let these 22 kids down or anything like that. Because really those days, I think some of the biggest impact you have is just by continuing to be there and show them that it's okay to have a little bit more of a relaxed life at times. It doesn't always have to be like, go, go, go.
Yeah. And this is another episode, but your nervous system and how it impacts the whole vibe of the classroom, like figuring out when you walk into that school, how can you get yourself regulated every day when you walk in that classroom? If you are dysregulated, you will dysregulate other kids.
Yeah.
It's just how humans are set up. So being mindful of that, think about your own tools and strategies that you can get yourself, or that your support network, your co-regulating person you talk to on the way in or grab coffee with. How can I get myself regulated to get in this classroom? Because my nervous system is going to impact those kids. And if I'm not in a good place, just be mindful of that, because I will react. And it's like parenting, right? I do it all the time with my kids. Like, I've just had my limit, and then I start yelling. And I'm like,
parent.
why am I yelling all of a sudden? Because I'm dysregulated, and it's not about them. It's because I had these other 6 things going on, and you're impacting my decision making right now, right?
Yeah.
So just being mindful about that, right?
Yeah, but there's like never a time, right? Like if you're a parent, there's never a time that you're like, and now you should have done this and this, and then the kid's like, you know what, you made a really good point. Like I'm feeling a lot better about myself. I think we're ready to go. That's not how it works.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, 30 minutes goes quick, Katie.
So
what are things that maybe we want, like one thing you want people to walk away from this episode, like holding on to?
I think, one, knowing what ACEs are and how they're going to impact the students, yourself, and our educational system, I think is really look into that. And then the first step is really being mindful about your own, nervous system, interoception, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
Just knowing who you are.
Whole other podcast.
Interoception. But like knowing who you are, and then knowing that we need to look at kids more holistically, that there's more, they are complex beings, and we have to really peel back the layers for some of our kids that are struggling.
Yeah. Yeah. I just kept thinking as we were kind of preparing for this individually, I just kept thinking that it's important for people to know that kids don't just do things or act poorly without a reason. And people in general don't, right? I think an important practice that I've tried to have, and I'm not perfect at it, but I think it's been really important, and it's shifted my mindset in general. Because in education, you work with a lot of people, right? You work with a lot of kids, but you work with a lot of adults too. And that can be interesting sometimes.
Yes.
Is that like the nice way of putting it?
Yeah.
It can be interesting sometimes. And so if you can start training yourself and start practicing very purposefully to remind yourself that when somebody is doing something that either frustrates you or seems like kind of a jerky move, or like they seem to be acting poorly in some way, again, adult, kid, doesn't matter, to start training yourself to think, there's a reason though. There's a reason they're doing
information.
that. And how can I actually be a person that improves their situation? Instead of like, what part can I play to improve? Not that you have to own that, not that I own that about situations I'm around, but what part can I play to maybe improve that person's life today instead of just being, some of the collateral damage in their path because of whatever's happening in their life that day. It's not easy, but I think if you can just even start minorly shifting how you see negative interactions with, people or people that are acting poorly, because people are acting poorly for a reason. They're not just doing it because they're awful people. Yeah. By and large.
Yeah. What a hard line shift to make, but what an important one.
It's very difficult.
Yeah.
And when you're having a rough day yourself, like it can be almost impossible. I don't do that perfectly myself by any stretch, but I think it's helped me so much to know that I can maybe shift myself a little bit, and then all of a sudden I own way less what other people are doing, because I'm like, oh, there's something else that's going on that has nothing to do with me.
Yeah. What a powerful first game changer step. Like if you're going to do anything, then tomorrow go in and just think about that when your colleague knocks on your door and has to, right?
I like how we assume it's a colleague too. Like we didn't even go to student. We went straight to colleague.
Colleagues usually are more dysregulated than kids most of the time, where the kid comes in flying in hot off the bus.
Yeah.
Think about how can
how can I do something that's positive? Yeah. Well, as always, thank you guys for joining us. Hopefully something in this was helpful to you. Hopefully you, whether you learned something or not, hopefully you're reminded of something, and this was an impactful conversation. If you have questions, again, we love hearing questions. We love hearing like, what are you going to do like in the future? Or here's something that we would love to hear you guys talk about in the future. Yeah. We love all those things. And so just thank you guys for being here. Now let's go out and let's do the work.
Let's do it.